All right, and welcome back to another episode of Cannaspirations. I am your host, Warren Harris, the Chief Compliance Officer at Cannaspire. Today, we're going to be discussing the recent federal activity surrounding cannabis rescheduling and the upcoming intoxicating hemp product ban. So, as way of how this is going to change the industry, we're going to be focusing on expert witness testimony within the cannabis industry. So please bear in mind we are not giving any legal advice, and today's discussion is strictly educational and practical.
Thanks, Warren. I'm Beck Selman, Cannaspire's Director of Compliance. Today, we're joined by chemist and testing lab expert Jimmy Dodsworth and cannabis attorney Natalie Diaz of Mandelbaum, Barrett, PC in New Jersey. Natalie, please introduce yourself.
Hey guys, I'm Natalie Diaz. I'm an associate at Mandelbaum Barrett within its cannabis, hemp, and psychedelic department. I'm licensed to practice law in New Jersey and New York, and I've been working in the cannabis industry since its inception of adult use cannabis in 2021. Within the cannabis industry, I primarily handle commercial transactions and contracts, commercial real estate, and regulatory compliance.
Outstanding. Thank you so much for joining us today. So really, let's jump right into the expert witness testimony topic and just what are some of the circumstances that someone might need an expert witness within the cannabis industry? What are some of the typical cases that you see?
Yes, Warren, sometimes legal cases in the cannabis industry get really complicated, and that's when an expert witness is essential. Why, you ask? Because cannabis laws are complex and they change from state to state. Like New Jersey's is completely different than New York's structure, it's different than Maryland, and so on and so forth. So an expert witness can explain the details, they can provide credibility, and they help the court understand what's standard practice in the industry. So a few common cases where you might need one is regulatory compliance disputes. For example, figuring out the differences between hemp and marijuana, or whether a company followed proper licensing and labeling rules. Second are business and financial disputes. So if there's a partnership disagreement, a merger conflict, or questions about revenue and operational practices, an expert can clearly break those down. And then also an interesting one is DUI cases. So cannabis-related impairment cases are extremely tricky because it's different from alcohol, where you can't measure the blood alcohol content to determine impairment or intoxication. So experts can also explain the THC levels, how it affects the body, and what those tests really mean. So the bottom line is anytime a case depends on cannabis-specific knowledge, such as regulatory, financial, or safety-related, an expert witness can make the complex situation simple for the court and also the jury.
Excellent. That makes sense. So what are the qualifications that a jury or a defense is looking for in a expert witness?
Yeah, so it really depends on the state and the type of standard that they use. So there's two primarily standards for admitting expert testimony. That's the Fry and the Daubert standards. The Fry standard looks at whether a method or opinion is generally accepted in the relevant scientific or professional community, whereas the Daubert standard focuses on whether the expert's methods are reliable and relevant, and they consider things like testing, peer reviews, error rates, and also logical reasoning. So because courts scrutinize expert testimony under these different legal standards, attorneys look for experts who are not only have a deep understanding in cannabis knowledge, but also the criteria that survives those scrutiny between those different standards. So some key qualifications can include industry expertise, professional credentials, such as their CVs, their licenses, their degrees, also their experience as an expert witness. So how many times they've testified in court before, their familiarity with writing reports, testifying in depositions as well, and also their credibility and reputation, whether they're respected in the field, they're unbiased, and if they have a clean professional record. Also, their communication skills is extremely important. Are they able to explain complex or technical issues to judges or juries in a layperson language without them getting confused? And also their analytical and practical skills, and whether they're capable of reviewing data, evaluating compliance, or assessing operational practices.
So, I mean, you hit on some of this, but how can a good expert witness, sway the case? And then also, what might be some of the things that, a judge or a jury might throw their testimony out for, right? Like, what's a good expert witness outcome, and what's one where they're going to obviously impeach them and just toss them out?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So, with expert witnesses, it depends on what side you're on. If you're on the defense side, you're going to get, an expert witness that favors more the defense. So you're going to get either like a doctor or professional that testifies that way. And also same for the other side, you're going to find someone who, is in basically favor of you. So, but, at the end of the day, it depends on, how well they're able to clearly articulate their knowledge and experience and explain that. So it's not necessarily whether they're wrong because, in any kind of field, there's also a matter of differences too. So it's just how well they can, articulate their opinion and explain it to the judge or jury.
So get an expert that knows how to debate and knows how to, really lean on to the things that matter, right? The differences that make a difference. That's actually a great point.
Yep.
So, what litigation do you think we might see now that, or when intoxicating hemp is officially banned?
Yes. So because of this new intoxicating hemp, bill that got passed recently that bans Delta-8 and similar cannabinoids, there's going to be like a myriad of challenges to that. One is the challenge to scope and enforcement. So businesses may question how the new law applies to scientific hemp-derived products or argue that federal agencies are exceeding their authority in enforcing it. There's also going to be vagueness or delegation challenges where the courts may be asked to clarify which products are prohibited and whether the law leaves too much room for discretion to federal agencies. And on that note, enforcement of, this new intoxicating hemp bill, there's so many regulatory agencies out there and, how are they able to come together to enforce it? For example, the DEA controls, substances. The FDA controls products intended for human consumption, and the USDA also controls hemp cultivation compliances. So it's going to be really interesting, how these agencies are going to be able to work together to enforce it and who's going to be really enforcing it too. Because, as we see in like chicken salmonella cases, the FDA and the USDA are fighting with each other about, who basically has jurisdiction to control these things. So I'm going to assume it's going to be similar with the intoxicating hemp. And also, another important one is the state versus federal conflicts. So as you know, the states have their own hemp programs and they may contest that federal law conflicts with their own state rules. And there's also going to be a lot of economic claims since operators are going to be facing lost revenue and they can bring lawsuits or class actions over the economic impact of the ban.
Sounds like
Yeah, I mean, go ahead, Beck.
sounds like there might be a need for some expert witnesses coming up here with this fiasco.
Yeah,
Yes,
I
for
agree.
sure.
Most
And I
definitely.
was just thinking really like the way that some states are getting ahead of it, like New Jersey, right? They're already planning to let this in. The national scene, like you said, you've got this, alphabet of different regulatory agencies. Who's in charge? I think the federal scene, where currently we see, Delta 8, Delta 9 being shipped all over, is going to be massively disrupted. And then you're going to see these small players in the hemp regulated states like New Jersey, New York, Florida, they're going to reestablish, right? And they're going to wait for sort of the dust to settle at a federal level. And so you're going to kind of see, the big players in this industry. I mean, from what I've heard, Curaleaf is backed out of the hemp industry entirely, which they're the biggest player in cannabis pretty much in the nation. So it's very interesting, what you're touching on with the state and federal discrepancy as to how that's going to really, right now there's a national Delta 9 soda industry. All of that could go away overnight, right? So I do think this is going to change radically. So, no, that was really great input, Natalie. Thank you so much.
Of course. Thanks for having me, guys.
Of course. So I'm going to go ahead and transition to asking Mr. Jimmy Dodsworth a few questions. So, first question, Jimmy, could you please introduce yourself and give us some of your background establishing and running cannabis and hemp testing facilities?
Sure. First off, Jimmy Dodsworth. I have a BS in chemistry from Westchester University, Pennsylvania. Um, I'd say the first part of my experience was working in analytical testing labs in the environmental arena. But in 2014, I built a lab, a quality control lab, which specifically was made for testing cannabis, hemp products, devices in Florida, which at the time and currently only has medical legislation approved. Um, but since 2020, I've been a consultant for the cannabis, hemp, marijuana industry, and I have built and designed 4 labs from the ground up and helped many, many other labs get their licensing and accreditation. Um, and I was able to do that primarily from what I did at my Florida lab and learning about ISO 17025 and different state licensing and requirements and stuff like that. Um, but I've been I've been doing this constantly since then, and I have worked with the biggest multi-state laboratory operators in the country and many, many others, and have a great deal of experience in every aspect of cannabis and hemp analysis, evaluation, quality control, uh, reporting, and done several, have several instances of being an expert witness.
Can you tell us a little bit about your experience as an expert witness and what kind of, circumstances around those cases?
Sure. So I did have a lot of experience in the environmental industry, which really helped once I started to become an expert witness in the cannabis industry. And I should say cannabis and hemp industry because a lot of it has to do with people saying, "Oh, I thought it was hemp," and the prosecution saying it was cannabis or marijuana. And that's primarily where I've come in, and I've been able to evaluate the data. I've been able to look at certificates of analysis, also known as COAs, l- specifically look at the methodologies, validation, and how the lab calculated error with the method in order to determine that this or that wasn't valid or is valid.
I mean, you touched on a little of this, and basically, what is the difference between a hemp product and a marijuana product, right? For the listeners out there.
Yeah. So essentially, I'm not going to get into the botany of everything, but essentially they're the same plant, but they have different levels of cannabinoids. Hemp primarily has CBD, cannabidiol. It is not an intoxicating cannabinoid. It has no intoxicating effects whatsoever, but it does have many, many medical efficacies, specifically childhood seizure disorders. And it is perfectly safe to give to newborns all the way up to, you know, those well into their 100s. And it's very, very helpful. So, uh, the difference is that hemp has very, very low amounts of THCA or tetrahydrocannabinol acid. Um, Marijuana, on the other hand, has low levels of CBD and high levels of THCA. THCA in itself will not get somebody high or anything like that. Uh, it needs to be decarboxylated, and by that I mean it needs to be heated up to over, I think, 184 degrees Fahrenheit. And once it's heated up, um, the compound will change a little bit. It'll give off a little bit of water and carbon dioxide. And at that point, the molecule will fit into both of uh, every mammal, specifically here, human, uh, cannabinoid receptors. And that's when it causes the effect of um, getting high, which is what most people call it. Um, we tend to call it a pharmacological or psychological effect in the scientific industry. Uh, but hemp legally is not allowed to have more than 0.3% THCA in it. THCA turns into delta 9 THC, and that's the primary culprit um, for the psychological activity that it causes.
So you're already
Marijuana,
touching on this. Could
yeah.
you describe a little of the difference because there's so many isomers out there, right? Like this delta 8, the delta 9, THCA. From a lab perspective, how do you go sorting all of this out, right?
So that's a great question, and it's actually very easy to do. Um, what every lab that I've been in and know of, which is are hundreds, uh, use to determine and quantify the concentration of cannabinoids in products is called high performance liquid chromatography, better known as HPLC. Essentially, the product, whether it be flour or an infused product like food, a tincture, a vape, it's extracted with a solvent. And the cannabinoids go into the solvent that is injected onto the HPLC instrument. And it has what's called a chromatography column built into it. This chromatography column separates all of the different and individual cannabinoids. And once they come off the column, separated, they go into a detector. And the detector sees them, and a peak, just like little peak like that, forms. The bigger the peak, the higher the concentration. But the key point here is that it separates the compounds. It separates THCA from delta 9 THC. It separates delta 8 THC from delta 9. It separates delta 10. There's actually two isomers of delta 10. Isomers are essentially the same compound, but they may have one thing pointing a different direction. uh,
And that's very
anyhow,
useful because some of these states are, Delta 8's legal and Delta 9's illegal, or Delta 10's illegal and Delta 8's legal. So,
so the interesting point about this whole thing is in both hemp and marijuana, there is very, very little delta 8. And delta 8 THC is psychoactive, but there's so little of it in both of these um, products that nobody ever considered it. And I think that's where, it's finally people are understanding what's going on, and they never ever considered it. Um, Once the 2018 Farm Bill passed and everybody was able to grow hemp in every state, Kentucky was previously the only state. Everybody started growing it. And once they did, they extracted the cannabinoids out of it. And since it primarily had THC in it and it didn't have, or excuse me, CBD in it, and it didn't have any THCA in it, they isolated the CBD, the cannabidiol, and purified it. From that, it is quite simple for a chemist to do a simple timed reaction using some type of acid to turn CBD into THC. So you can make CBD, which is not psychoactive, into a THC, which is. If you
Definitely.
let it go for a little while at certain temperatures, you can turn it into delta 9 THC. Most people doing it out there aren't as technically adept, so they just let the reaction go. And when they do, it turns into delta 8 THC, which I said is also psychoactive, but it's not found at hardly any levels in either plant. But once they extract the CBD and modify it, now they have huge levels of delta 8. And it's psychoactive. It's similar to the activity of delta 9, but not exactly. Typically, you're going to find it in a vape or an infused product like a gummy or something like that. You're never going to find delta 8 in a flower product ever.
Interesting.
Um,
So if like, the only evidence you were somebody was arrested for possession, and the only evidence was that the lab report showed it was slightly above the allowable THC for hemp, right?
mhm.
What scientific weaknesses would you look at first, and how would you try to,
Yeah, the
prove
first
it?
thing I'm going to look at is how close is it to that 0.3% level? 0.3% um, is actually a lot when we're talking about cannabinoids. Uh, when we look for cannabinoids, we look for them in parts per million levels. And 0.3% is 3,000 parts per million. So it's quite a lot. But it takes that, it probably takes about 10 times that amount to get somebody high or, psychoactively affect them. Um, but with that being said, level, if it's close, can be disputed. And by close, I mean 0.4, 0.5%. It can be easily disputed because there is no chemical methodology that doesn't have absolute error involved in it. And in order to prove that a lab's result is correct, they would need to evaluate every point in the method, the extraction, the testing, where error could come up. It could come up with using a syringe to inject an extract into a vial. It could come in on the instrument, which has a detector that has a variance of at least 2%, even with the best detectors. Um,
So you know
so
what
you
those
can look at that.
error rates,
And,
those error percentages are in those testing methods, right? And you can
yeah,
look at.
and that's where you can really question people. And like I mentioned, I've been in over 100 cannabis laboratories, probably close to over 200, but 100 to be sure. And I only know of two of them that have done all of the error calculations and statistical evaluations that should be done in order to be able to accurately report what a result is, but report it with the error. So you might say, oh, it's 0.31% with a possible error of 0.26% or something like that. And
enough
that really throws
enough to create, reasonable doubt that the
a lot of reasonable doubt.
and very well, very good. Thank you, Jimmy. We really appreciate you joining us today.
Yeah, I
Very
mean, this
insightful.
is fascinating because what he just described was people have giant fields of hemp that are just one short acid wash away from turning into Delta 8 or Delta 9. And this is how they've been generating tons of intoxicating hemp products. Literally, all of that is about the change. And so what Jimmy's talking about is there's going to be a ton of lag in what, Natalie was mentioning, the regulatory oversight, who's in charge of this federal program, and then also just, who is still selling it and trying to make a buck off of their hemp field and who's going to be the unwitting buyer that we're already seeing thinking that they're buying something that's hemp in good faith, and then it turns out it's not. This is going to continue to be a problem, right? So this is really why we were harping on the expert witness aspect today, because we know that these cases are going to continue to pop up, especially as we approach the, plateau for the ban federally. So I just wanted to thank our guests today, Natalie and Jimmy. Thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome.
And guys, it's
Hi.
been another episode of Cannaspirations. Thank you all for joining us here, and we'll see you next time.